Collapse does not arrive as a moment. It arrives as a sequence of mechanical failures that compound faster than civilians can psychologically process. The first 90 days are not a dramatic battlefield, but a biological filter that eliminates those who rely on assumptions built during stable civilization. When electricity dies, water stops shortly after. When water stops, sanitation collapses. When sanitation collapses, microbes become predators. The majority will not register these transitions until they are already inside the kill zone. Most deaths in early-stage collapse are quiet, dehydration hidden behind confusion, infection disguised as fatigue, exposure creeping in during the first cold night without power, and the paralysis that locks the human brain when old rules vanish. Crowd psychology becomes a weapon against the unprepared. Panic is not random. It is predictable physics. When supply lines break, population density becomes a threat multiplier. Thousands of people compete for resources designed for a few hundred. The result is compression, aggression, and stampede logic. No heroism, only math. History proves this in every blackout, siege, and urban disaster. The first wave of casualties comes from hesitation, not violence. Civilians wait for rescue. They expect announcements, trucks, authorities. But in collapse, no one is coming. Systems cannot restart because the infrastructure that sustains them is already dead. Survival in this window depends on rejecting emotional interpretation and switching to operational thinking. Water becomes the primary clock. Heat loss becomes an enemy. Movement becomes life. The ones who live are not the strongest, but the fastest to abandon the illusion that order will return. Collapse respects only inputs, outputs, and physics. Collapse follows a trajectory as rigid as gravity. Infrastructure does not fail randomly. It fails in a chain reaction with measurable intervals. Electricity disappears first, and with it the pumps that keep municipal water moving. Within hours, pressure drops. Faucets run dry. Once water systems stall, waste systems stall with them. Toilets clog. Drains backflow. Organic matter accumulates. Bacteria begin replicating at exponential rates. The environment transitions from habitable to hostile long before most civilians realize the shift has begun. Every modern city relies on invisible mechanical lungs. When those lungs stop, the organism dies. Historical evidence shows identical patterns across continents and eras. In the 1977 New York blackout, violence erupted within minutes because lighting vanished and crowd logic filled the vacuum. In Sarajevo, water scarcity reshaped how civilians moved, lived, and died. In Haiti's 2010 quake, sanitation failure triggered disease outbreaks faster than rescue teams could respond. In every refugee crisis, the same physics appears. When resources concentrate and humans cluster, pathogens acquire the perfect engine. Collapse is not an explosion. It is a silent expansion of risk radiating through systems designed to be stable, not resilient. As the grid stays down, supply chains fracture, food distribution halts, fuel reserves shrink because pumps depend on electricity. Refrigeration fails, transforming perishables into microbial hazards. Transportation stops, leaving shelves empty within 48 hours. Civilians interpret this as temporary inconvenience. They assume repair crews, technicians, and government agencies will stabilize the system, but collapse does not reverse. Once multiple pillars fall simultaneously, power, water, logistics, there is no path back without industrial-scale coordination, which no longer exists. The kill chain intensifies as desperation rises. Crowds converge on shrinking resource nodes, supermarkets, gas stations, distribution centers. Competition transforms into violence, Because scarcity is not emotional, it is mathematical. A population designed for continuous supply cannot survive interruption. The 90-day arc becomes predictable. The first 7 days remove the passive. The first 30 remove the dependent, and the remaining 60 crush those who fail to adapt to the physics of a world no longer maintained by machines. Understanding this trajectory is not theory. It is survival. Once you see the chain, you know where to stand and what to avoid. Those who cannot read the arc become part of it. The first 7 days form the most critical window because civilians still believe the event is temporary. This belief kills more efficiently than any weapon. Shock suppresses decision-making. People cling to routine, waiting for updates, checking dead phones, standing in lines that will never move again. The human brain refuses to accept system death, and this hesitation consumes the time required to build the foundations of survival. While the majority freeze, a small fraction begins securing water, territory, and information. That fraction becomes the baseline of the survivor curve. Crowd behavior during this phase is governed by compression physics. As supplies shrink, populations concentrate into fewer functional nodes. Supermarkets, pharmacies, and fuel stations become bottlenecks. The density spike triggers aggression, stampedes, and opportunistic violence. None of it is personal. It is simple resource math. A store built for 100 customers cannot absorb 1,000 desperate civilians. The structure becomes a trap, with exits blocked by bodies moving under panic logic. Anyone inside these locations during the early days enters a probability field where the outcome is dictated by chaos, not strategy. Operational thinking demands the opposite trajectory. You move away from crowds, not toward them. You secure water immediately because water availability drops faster than food and kills sooner. A small reserve buys decision space. A perimeter, even improvised, establishes psychological and tactical stability. Intel becomes oxygen, the ability to observe patterns, track movement, and detect shifts in local behavior. Civilians act predictably when systems fail. They cluster, they argue, they wait. Survivors do not. Mobility defines the difference. Most people stay inside their homes believing the walls will protect them from a world they do not yet understand. But static positions attract attention. Noise, light, and movement become signals that draw competitors. The first week requires controlled displacement, short, purposeful movements to gather resources before the larger population realizes scarcity is permanent. Those who act in this window gain a decisive advantage. Those who delay are already mathematically eliminated. Collapse rewards speed, clarity, and discipline, not hope. By the second week, the illusion of temporary disruption dissolves. Scarcity becomes the dominant force shaping human behavior. Food supplies decay. Water sources degrade. The psychological shift is universal. Cooperation contracts. Self-preservation expands. This is the period when civilians begin to understand the truth, but too late to compensate for earlier hesitation. The environment transitions from panic to predation, not because people become cruel, but because the logic of survival overrides social conditioning. Every historical collapse records this phase with identical patterns. As refrigeration fails, stored food rots. As shelves empty, competition escalates. The hunger curve does not rise gradually. It spikes. Caloric deprivation alters cognition, reducing patience and increasing volatility. Groups that once negotiated now intimidate. Strangers who once passed quietly now assess each other as threats or opportunities. In Venezuela's economic breakdown, gangs emerged not months later, but within weeks, taking control of food distribution routes. In Bosnia, civilians who ventured for water or bread risked sniper fire. In Syria's early civil fragmentation, neighborhoods became micro-territories enforced by whoever controlled force and rationing. In this window, visibility becomes a liability. Survivors who display resources, light, noise, fire, food, smells, movement, broadcast their position to hungry competitors. The operational response is concealment, reduce signature, move silently, cook minimally or not at all, store supplies in dispersed caches rather than a single stockpile that can be lost in one confrontation. Territory must be defined not by fences or walls, but by information dominance, knowing who passes through your area, when, and why. Energy management becomes critical. Every calorie, every step, every action has a cost. Civilians burn energy inefficiently because they attempt to maintain old routines. Survivors adopt conservation as doctrine. They move only when necessary. Choose indirect routes, avoid open areas. They understand that encounters are not debates. They are resource contests where the unprepared lose by default. Food itself transforms from an asset into a vulnerability. A stockpile increases survival odds, but also increases risk. Others can smell it, see traces of it, notice behavioral patterns around it. Protecting food requires more strategy than obtaining it. Stealth procurement, water purification, low visibility gathering, and nocturnal movement become the mechanics of survival. By day 30, society no longer resembles its former structure. Authority fractures. Local power centers emerge. The resource war is not a metaphor. It is the unavoidable evolution of human behavior under pressure. Those who adapt to its logic endure. Those who cling to old expectations do not. By the fourth week, the primary threat is no longer violence. It is biology. When infrastructure dies, microorganisms inherit the environment. Waste accumulates in alleys, stairwells, basements, and every container meant to carry water. Without pressure in the pipes, contaminants backflow into sinks and bathtubs. Human waste, animal remains, food scraps, and stagnant water combine into pathogen engines. The city becomes a petri dish, scaled to millions. This is the period where mortality accelerates, not suddenly, but relentlessly, through mechanisms civilians rarely consider until it is too late. Water sources that once seemed safe undergo rapid transformation. Bacteria multiply every 20 minutes under ideal collapse conditions. Clear water is not clean water. Most civilians cannot detect contamination, so they drink what is available. Diarrheal disease follows, stripping the body of water and electrolytes faster than they can be replaced. In modern disasters, dehydration from illness kills more efficiently than starvation. Cholera in Haiti, typhus in wartime Europe, dysentery in refugee corridors, all demonstrate the same principle. Microbes exploit the collapse with perfect efficiency. Trash piles become breeding grounds for flies and rodents. Flies land on waste, then on food, transferring pathogens mechanically. Rodents carry leptospirosis, hantavirus, and parasites. Once their population expands, and it always expands, they invade homes seeking calories. Civilians, weakened by hunger and fatigue, fail to defend against these invisible attacks. Survivors implement microsanitation, controlled disposal pits, chemical disinfection, burning waste when possible, and strict separation of living areas from contamination zones. These routines appear excessive to the untrained. They are not. They are mathematical necessities. Thermal exposure compounds the danger. Without heating or cooling, indoor temperatures drift toward outdoor extremes. Hypothermia kills even in mild climates when bodies are dehydrated and underfed. Hyperthermia overwhelms those who ration water incorrectly. Civilians underestimate temperature because they rely on conditioned architecture. Collapse exposes their biology. Heat loss, sweat rate, and metabolic decline become lethal variables. Survivors adapt through layering, insulation improvisation, controlled ventilation, and hydration discipline. Corpse accumulation magnifies all threats. Decomposition attracts insects and animals, and while the corpse itself is not the primary hazard, the ecosystem it creates is. In past sieges, bodies left in streets accelerated disease far more than active combat did. Handling remains requires distance, tools, and protective layering, not out of fear, but out of bacterial logic. During this phase, discipline outweighs strength. Clean hands, boiled water, controlled waste, and predictable routines are the real weapons. Biology does not negotiate. It consumes the careless first, then the exhausted, then the unprepared. Survival belongs to those who treat microbes as the most efficient predators of the collapse. By the 7th week, the landscape shifts again. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion have thinned the population. What remains is a smaller, harder subset. Individuals and groups who learned, adapted, or forcefully took what they needed. This is when the human environment stops resembling a failed society and begins functioning like fragmented territory. The collapse stabilizes into a new structure: microtribes, roaming crews, armed families, opportunistic gangs, and quiet survivors who avoid all contact. Each operates by its own rules because no higher authority exists to override them. Territory becomes currency. Water points, abandoned medical sites, defensible high-ground buildings, and intersections that control movement all gain strategic value. Whoever occupies them gains leverage. In Bosnia, factions controlled streets not for symbolism but for line-of-sight dominance. In parts of Syria, a single well dictated who lived in an entire district. In Venezuela, criminal groups consolidated their control by taxing access to food markets. The pattern repeats because the logic is universal. When resources fragment, power fragments, and force becomes the method that shapes distribution. Checkpoints emerge, some crude, some organized. They are not always armed with guns. Sometimes they are manned by desperate people who have nothing left to lose. These choke points restrict mobility, demand barter, or enforce arbitrary rules. Civilians approaching them often hope for negotiation. Survivors do not. They treat checkpoints as traps with unpredictable outcomes. The correct response is avoidance, not engagement. The ability to move unseen becomes more valuable than any tool carried. Kidnapping and forced labor become predictable extensions of scarcity. Groups require manpower to fortify positions, guard supply lines, and conduct scavenging operations. In multiple collapse scenarios, abductees were not taken for ransom, but for labor efficiency. The mistake civilians make is believing they are too insignificant to be targeted. In collapse, insignificance is irrelevant. Utility is everything. Evasion replaces confrontation as the survival doctrine. You reduce visibility not only physically but behaviorally, moving at hours when others rest, avoiding paths that funnel movement, suppressing noise discipline, and eliminating patterns. The most successful survivors in historical sieges were those who appeared to vanish, not those who fought. Misdirection becomes a tool. A displaced object, a false trail, a faint noise thrown in the opposite direction. Small actions redirect attention long enough to bypass danger. Humans operating under deprivation have narrow focus. Providing them something to fixate on saves your energy and avoids unnecessary conflict. Mobility now demands intelligence more than speed. Every movement requires a question. Who claims this area? What do they want? And how do they enforce control? Survivors map human behavior the way others map terrain. They know where aggression peaks, where silence means danger, and where no one goes for reasons worth discovering. By day 90, the world stabilizes into a primal order. The predators are not monsters. They are humans recalibrated to a system with no laws, no infrastructure, and no surplus. Strength alone does not guarantee survival. Awareness, timing, invisibility, and restraint do. Those who endure this phase do so by refusing the instinct to fight every threat and choosing instead to navigate around them with precision. Survival beyond the first 60 days is never determined by luck or brute strength. It is governed by rules as fixed as any law of physics, and these rules filter the remaining population with cold precision. The first rule is mobility. Static positions invite discovery, and discovery invites extraction of resources, labor, or life. Those who cling to homes, shelters, or familiar ground become predictable targets. Survivors treat location as temporary and movement as normal, shifting routes and routines before patterns form. The second rule is secrecy. Visibility becomes death long before violence arrives. Every sound, every light, every scent is a signal transmitted into a hungry environment. The disciplined survivor reduces signature to near zero. Fires are shielded or abandoned altogether. Cooking is minimized. Water is boiled in concealed locations, or at times when ambient noise disguises activity. Supplies are stored in layers, one small visible cache to satisfy a searcher, and the true reserves hidden where only the survivor can reach them. Information about capability, tools, weapons, injuries, numbers is never revealed. What others do not know, they cannot exploit. The third rule is redundancy. Equipment fails, containers break, routes close, injuries occur. A single point of failure becomes a death sentence. The survivors who persist maintain duplicates of essentials, water purification methods, fire-starting tools, navigation techniques, and shelter strategies. They never rely on one solution because collapse eliminates convenience without warning. The fourth rule is hydration discipline. Food is optional. Water is not. The human body can function on minimal calories for weeks, but a single day of poor hydration can destroy judgment, motor skills, and survival capacity. Water is sourced before hunger is addressed, purified before storage, rationed according to exertion rather than emotion. The ones who drink too little die slowly. The ones who drink carelessly die suddenly. The fifth rule is information advantage. Knowledge is leverage in a world where chaos has erased structure. Survivors listen more than they speak. They observe movement patterns, identify who controls what territory, track when crowds gather and when silence spreads. They watch weather, animals, shadows, and smoke. Information becomes a weapon that prevents confrontation, locates opportunity, and exposes danger before it matures. The final rule is psychological detachment. Emotional interpretation of events is replaced by operational assessment. Fear becomes data. Stress becomes a signal. Regret is discarded because it consumes time and bandwidth. In every documented collapse, the individuals who endure longest are not the most aggressive but the most disciplined, the ones who move when movement is required, hide when hiding is smart, and act with clarity instead of impulse. Survival is not heroism. It is obedience to rules that do not bend. Those who accept these rules early shape the trajectory of their own curve. Those who resist them become part of the statistics that define collapse. 90 days after the collapse, the world has completed its transformation. What remains is not a damaged version of the old system, but a new environment operating under primal mathematics. Infrastructure does not recover. Supply lines do not restart. Authorities, if they exist at all, control only fragments. The majority of the population is gone, claimed by dehydration, infection, exposure, violence, or the paralysis that kept them waiting for help that never came. The numbers are not surprising. They follow the same attrition curve recorded in sieges, famines, and systemic outages across history. When a system built on constant input is deprived of that input, the population dependent on it contracts sharply and predictably. The survivors standing at day 90 are not defined by strength, ideology, or luck. They are defined by adaptation. They understood early that collapse was not an interruption, but an environment. They stopped expecting restoration and instead aligned themselves with the new physics of scarcity, silence, and consequence. They treated water as priority, concealment as doctrine, movement as necessity, and information as fuel. They read human behavior the way others read weather. They operated below visibility thresholds and avoided the gravitational pull of crowds, conflict, and desperation. The mathematical truth of collapse is indifferent to morality. It rewards those who adjust to its rules and erases those who attempt to negotiate with it. The 90-day threshold is not a victory, but a filter. Passing through it means understanding that survival is not a return to what once was, but an ongoing process shaped by discipline, awareness, and control over one's own signature in a world where attention is danger. The collapse does not care who deserved to live. It only measures who understood its rules in time.